Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 21 of Series 9. The question for today is, does the prescriptivism of Richard Hare and others provide a theory of ethics at all? So reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 4, Section 2. So my basic philosophical question is again, what can we do with human existence as consciousness? I answer in terms of value and the will to value leading to a certain sufficiency of value. And because ethics is about values, I look to ethical theory to help me understand values. We have looked at many theories of ethics such as virtue theory, utilitarianism and Kantian ethics. Yet there are many other theories of ethics like emotivism, expressivism and contractualism, as well as existentialist and postmodernist theories of ethics. And things like Rawls, Parfit, Nagel and Dworkin also have their own theories of ethics. So today I want to look at prescriptivism, the ethical theory espoused by Richard Hare and others. Yet, as implied in the main question of this discussion, prescriptivism may not be an ethical theory at all. This is because although Hare presupposes certain moral values like justice, rights and fairness, his prescriptivism is largely about philosophical method of a particular kind. That is, a method that is largely linguistic, focusing on the clarification of concepts and their logical relations. And Hare believes that an emphasis on method is needed due to the problems in ethics. He strongly endorses, for example, Hume's prohibition on deriving ought from is, and he maintains a strong distinction between facts and values, although the is-ought and the fact-value distinctions are held to be different. That is, many people, like Hare and myself, endorse Hume's more substantial is-ought distinction, but Hare also endorses a strict fact-value distinction that others, like Putnam and myself, disagree with. Yet there's another meaning of prescriptivism that means that something ought or should be done. This is contrasted to descriptive statements that are just talking about what something is like. But prescriptivism can be understood in two other ways. One view is a neutral and non-committal method of examination. It's notable that Hare upholds the fact-value distinction that makes this kind of neutrality easier. Another view is that such a methodology has moral consequences. Yet methodological prescriptivism tends to have ethical implications. To understand what ethical prescriptivism means, we can compare it with other kinds of moral judgment. For a moral realist, the statement "murder is wrong" claims a property of wrongness in the act of murder. According to the moral relativist, this statement only means that murder is disapproved of by society. According to emotivism, the statement only expresses an attitude of the speaker. But according to prescriptivism, it means do not murder. That is, it's not just expressing a description or an emotion, but it's an imperative. However, prescriptivism is non-committal on the question of whether murder is actually right or wrong. It is interested in the conceptual analysis of moral concepts such as murder, and it is part of the conceptual analysis of prescriptivism to ask, what does the word murder mean? Following this thinking, we can ask whether it's possible to ask whether murder is right or wrong. This is because wrongness is part of the meaning of murder that can't be divorced from it. So murder is always wrong, and the word needs to be replaced by another, like killing. We would then have to ask, is it wrong to kill other people? Other examples can be found, such as the question, is stealing wrong? But again, wrongness is part of the meaning of stealing and can't easily be taken out of the word. And the question would have to be rephrased as, is it wrong to take things that are not yours? But these aren't questions that prescriptivism asks or can answer, yet they show the importance of analysing moral concepts as prescriptivism does. On a misconstrual of prescriptivism, language might be thought to provide such value imperatives. But language can't account for every aspect of our moral lives as it would have to. And even if it did, trivial values found in language are insufficient to provide moral imperatives. As a neutral method, Hare claims an affinity with utilitarianism that expresses a calculative aspect of rationality. That is, he claims to be a utilitarian in the sense of being a logician in the study of concepts. And he says that the analysis of concepts is essential to doing philosophy. For this reason, Hare is an exponent of formal but not material constraints on moral values. Formal content is concerned with principles like do no harm or love your enemy, but the material content is about the detailed expression of such principles. On this view, prescriptivism is a methodological account without an overriding formal or moral principle of value, and it is ostensibly neutral about the grounds on which its methods are based. Yet both method and rationality influences theory in various ways. Hare, for instance, has similar views to Kant in holding the importance of universality and prescriptivity. Universal prescriptivism means that the command do not murder holds for everyone. That is, anyone making such a prescription should be equally willing to make it about anyone else. Prescriptivity is the idea that moral judgments have a bearing on our actions if we believe them. Yet these are rationalist and cognitivist ideas that will influence a conception of the good. And this rationalist influence can be seen in such concepts as fairness and equality. Another moral implication of prescriptivism is the idea that the ordinary usage of moral language is prescriptive. That is, what pervades moral language is an imperative rather than an indicative. An example of this, as well as the apparent ambivalence in prescriptivism, is found in an argument by John Searle. We have previously seen Searle's argument on how to derive an ought from an is. That is, speech acts make moral commitments based on promising with subsequent obligations. Yet Hare endorses Hume's principle with certain moral consequences, and Searle seems to present his argument as an academic exercise. For Hare, moral philosophy requires the study of concepts in which theories are posed, and he focuses on the concept of ought because he sees it as the most basic and central concept in ethics. Prescriptivism is also described as universal prescriptivism, as above, meaning applicable to everyone. This is an aspect of prescriptivism that has been compared to Kant's prioritization of universality. But Kant replaces Hare's analysis of ought with the imperative of must. That is, Hare's universal prescriptivism derives moral analyses from linguistic examination of the word ought, and moral statements are distinct from others as prescriptions about how we think things ought to be, as well as being distinct from other prescriptions due to their universality. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy thereby informs us that Hare's system was also able to accommodate a central part of the Kantian outlook, and that in this way Hare's theory preserved the important emotivist thesis that a person's moral commitments are not rationally challengeable for their content, but only for their coherence with that person's other moral commitments, unquote. It's questionable, however, whether the universality shared by Kant and Hare is of any consequence. That is, Kant is striving for a moral imperative, but Hare is striving for a neutral moral methodology. Another seemingly neutral question of this kind that Hare takes up is whether ought implies can. This apparently anodyne question has been debated extensively in analytic philosophy. Ought is often held to imply can because if an agent cannot perform an action, he can't be blamed for not acting. But if he can perform an action, he might ought to perform it. But Hare is critical of this idea, and in my view, exceptions to ought implies can be highlighted by restating it as ought always implies can. So on its restatement as ought always implies can, one exception will disprove the rule. And an exception could be found in an agent's point of view in which he does not know if he can or cannot act. And if he does not know that he cannot act, then he ought to try to act. But an objectivist ethics will assume a third-person view rather than the agent's first-person view. And on this view, an agent will know whether he can act or not. But in practice, an agent will not have access to this third-person view. I don't think that the ought implies is question is very interesting, but it does bring us back to a third-person, ostensibly moral, neutral point of view. This ostensibly moral neutrality and methodological and linguistic inclinations introduces a topic for us. That is, an exercise in methodology and linguistic philosophy that we haven't yet undertaken in these workshops. Standard courses in philosophy cover basic topics of method, problems of knowledge and language. But we haven't covered any of these essential topics in these workshops. So we can include an examination of language in the study of prescriptivism. We can start by saying that Hare's prescriptivism was a product of linguistic philosophy in the mid-20th century. The importance of language in philosophy can be partly explained by its necessity in any description. Some form of language is also essential to argument and to logic. So language came to be seen as both necessary and universal. And in the mid-20th century, the linguistic turn, all problems of philosophy were regarded as linguistic problems. Wittgenstein, for example, saw problems as confusions that needed to be dissolved rather than resolved. And questions of ethics, metaphysics and mind were turned into questions about meaning of statements. For example, what does the word stealing mean, rather than what thoughts and actions does stealing involve? And the mental property of intentionality was redefined by William Neal and others. into the linguistic concept of intentionality, spelt with an S. This turned difficult problems into more manageable questions about language. But there were some challenges to this practice. John Mackey, for example, argued that a psychological state cannot necessarily be described through a linguistic description that is merely possible and contingent state of affairs, that is language. Some thinkers nevertheless took this exclusivity of language even further. Anthony Kenny and William Neal held that propositions essential to all mental life except bare sentience. This means that language is deemed an essential precondition to thinking and believing. Yet against this view, Noam Chomsky, John Searle and others accept the fact of thought without language. Arguments for non-linguistic thought can be drawn from animals and non-linguistic humans. But Kenny goes even further to claim that self-consciousness presupposes and an exception could be found in an agent's point of view in which he does not know if he can or cannot act. And if he does not know that he cannot act, then he ought to try to act. But an objectivist ethics will assume a third-person view rather than the agent's first-person view. And on this view, an agent will know whether he can act or not. But in practice, an agent will not have access to this third-person view. I don't think that the ought implies is question is very interesting, but it does bring us back to a third-person, ostensibly moral, neutral point of view. This ostensibly moral neutrality and methodological and linguistic inclinations introduces a topic for us, that is, an exercise in methodology and linguistic philosophy that we haven't yet undertaken in these workshops. Standard courses in philosophy cover basic topics of method, problems of knowledge and language, but we haven't covered any of these essential topics in these workshops, so we can include an examination of language in the study of prescriptivism. We can start by saying that Hare's prescriptivism was a product of linguistic philosophy in the mid-20th century. The importance of language in philosophy can be partly explained by its necessity in any description. Some form of language is also essential to argument and to logic. So language came to be seen as both necessary and universal. And in the mid-20th century, the linguistic turn, all problems of philosophy were regarded as linguistic problems. Wittgenstein, for example, saw problems as confusions that needed to be dissolved rather than resolved. And questions of ethics, metaphysics and mind were turned into questions about meaning of statements. For example, what does the word stealing mean, rather than what thoughts and actions does stealing involve? And the mental property of intentionality was redefined by William Neal and others into the linguistic concept of intentionality, spelt with an S. This turned difficult problems into more manageable questions about language. But there were some challenges to this practice. John Mackey, for example, argued that a psychological state cannot necessarily be described through a linguistic description that is merely possible and contingent state of affairs, that is language. Some thinkers nevertheless took this exclusivity of language even further. Anthony Kenny and William Neal held that propositions are central to all mental life except bare sentience. This means that language is deemed an essential precondition to thinking and believing. Yet against this view, Noam Chomsky, John Searle and others accept the fact of thought without language. Arguments for non-linguistic thought can be drawn from animals and non-linguistic humans. But Kenny goes even further to claim that self-consciousness presupposes the possession of language. But the existence of non-linguistic humans shows that self-consciousness does not presuppose language. And in my view, the linguistic turn has been a misleading detour for philosophy. Yet the heritage of linguistic philosophy has been mixed. Wittgenstein made great strides forward in the theory of language and meaning, as well as excesses. Yet Wittgenstein's philosophy of language is understood as having two versions, the earlier and the later. His earlier view was a picture theory of language that is only meaningful if pictured in the real world. This view assumes an unbridgeable gap between language and what is expressed non-verbally. So in Wittgenstein's early view, language had to function as a pictorial representation. But both versions attempted to resolve philosophical problems in terms of language. Upon writing this view in his Tractatus, he claimed to have solved all problems of philosophy and thereby retired. But after discussion with the Vienna Circle, he found he hadn't solved all the problems and returned to philosophy. Wittgenstein then developed his complex or use theory of language and meaning. He moved away from his early atomistic view with a single foundation that he inherited from Bertrand Russell. His later view involved many complex and overlapping practices that he called language games. That is, he described language as a form of life that represented the complex interrelations of life. So the meaning of words cannot be adequately found by looking them up in a dictionary, and he thereby famously rejected the idea of a private language of only one person. Yet it's important to note a common feature of Wittgenstein's early and later philosophies of language. In both views, he claimed that philosophical problems arise because we misunderstand language, and that they could be similarly resolved or dissolved, as he put it, by understanding language. What changed was Wittgenstein's conception of how language works. It's within this context that Hare made the now seemingly more modest claims of prescriptivism. Not only did prescriptivism come out of this linguistic turn, but postmodern deconstruction of language came out of linguistics and prescriptivism. That is, postmodernism made a radical critique of deconstruction of the meaning of language. Jacques Derrida criticized the history of philosophy as logocentric, implying absolute meaning. He held that the meaning of the text is undecidable and that language is subjective. Derrida famously claimed that there is no outside text. That is to say, its meaning is open, not fixed, and no outside authority can impose meaning on it. Such may be an editor or church telling us what a book or piece of scripture must mean. So postmodernists hold that there is no fixed intrinsic meaning to text which is attributed to the reader, and they will not even privilege or value the meaning attributed by the author over the reader. For example, Paul Ricoeur describes the author as the first reader. So on this view, scripture, constitutions and statute laws are open to different and equally valid interpretations. On a postmodernist view, we can then say that the meaning of the text is open to personal, if not valued, judgments. That is, the text is not only open to interpretation, but to radical interpretation almost without limit. That is, the meaning of the text is subject to the knowledge, judgment and goodwill of the reader. This seems to be implausible, especially with factual or scientific text. Another interpretation of this view is a refusal to locate value preferences in the external world. This again shows an unacknowledged relation between postmodernism and value. Derrida's argument for the relativity of language is that meaning is both historical and structural. He describes historical meaning obscurely as diachronic and structural or immediate meaning as synchronic. This means that meanings really refer to all other references which are in fact absent. But this cannot be done, so the full meaning of anything can't be fully articulated. But I'm skeptical whether the postmodern theory of meaning takes us very far. Standard critiques of language and Wittgenstein's complex theory also reject complete meaning. And deconstruction might be seen as a continuation of prescriptivism as an analysis of language. Jürgen Habermas also criticized postmodernism as reflective, that he called the paradox of self-referentiality. That is, employing analytic and linguistic critiques that only modern reason can provide, and that it assumes social and psychological structures in its criticisms that it ostensibly rejects. He accuses Foucault of not using his analysis of power against the status of his own writings, and that postmodernism uses social and psychological theories on a pragmatic ad hoc basis. Habermas makes a further criticism of postmodernism that Hare would certainly agree with, that their experimental and obfuscated language is less communicative than traditional thought. Habermas accuses Derrida of trying to turn reason into a kind of rhetoric. This may or may not be the case, but Derrida admitted to using convoluted language to avoid being thought simplistic. Yet my response to Habermas is that his criticism is inadequate. That is, he criticizes postmodern methods rather than confronting its underlying philosophical positions. That is, as might be expected of an analytic philosopher, Habermas doesn't defend substantive concepts against postmodernist attacks. Yet this is a criticism that we can make against prescriptivism as well as against Habermas and linguistic philosophy. That is, these schools of philosophy may provide useful or even essential concepts, but they omit vital philosophical topics that are in danger of being overlooked, which in my view include the concepts of consciousness and an appreciation of value. Hare responds to this question, saying that philosophers can only ask questions that other theorists need to resolve. But this reflects a view of analytic philosophy as only a method without substantive questions in itself. Yet this is a question of value judgment that analytic philosophy has consequently ignored. Yet philosophical thinking nevertheless followed chronologically from prescriptivism as well as conceptually. In this way, prescriptivism was followed by descriptivism, such as espoused by Philippa Foot. On descriptivism, issues of value were taken up as empirical facts. That is, for example, value is an empirical fact. Descriptivism also asks how language is used in everyday life and looks at possible values in language. And certain relations are thought to exist between some words like names and meanings or values. We can go on to ask whether meanings or values are supervenient on such terms. That is, do they have contingent or necessary relations with those terms? One kind of relation is the necessary or logical relations that Hare repudiates. He writes there isn't such a logical link between factual premises and moral conclusions. Another kind of relation is a semantic or semiotic one, as a sign indicating something about the terms in question. However, such are empirical and thereby contingent facts which aren't able to justify moral values. In this way, language is able to offer anthropological or psychological material for study, but it isn't able to underpin moral theory as language enthusiasts have supposed. Yet what I would like to present language as an aspect of conceptual apprehension that is necessary to consciousness. That is, on an externalist theory, an external world is a necessary condition of consciousness. And as previously explained, such theorists hold that a brain alone isn't a sufficient condition of consciousness. Then, as Hilary Putnam and others have argued, a brain in a vat can't produce consciousness. The point is that language is an aspect of the conceptual apprehension of the world, and it can thereby be seen as having a part to play in producing consciousness and mental states. There isn't much time to develop this view here, but it shows how a descriptivist view of language can be relevant to the genealogy of consciousness, mental states and values. So what is the conclusion to our question, does Hare's prescriptivism provide a theory of ethics at all? Prescriptivism is certainly a methodological analysis of moral language and concepts. And in this respect, Hare claims a certain objectivity or neutrality appropriate to that task. Yet modern skeptics would doubt whether such is feasible. Hare, for instance, holds the view that facts and values are distinct and separate, and at the time of writing his works he says that he can find no credible arguments to the contrary. But today that evidence is much stronger in the forms of studies of value-ladenness in social science, as well as works such as Hilary Putnam's entitled The Collapse of the Fact-Valued Dichotomy. Underlying moral values can also be seen in presupposed moral virtues like fairness, justice and equality. And these are even implied in supposedly neutral methodological principles like universality. There is also the question of relevance of such theoretical and linguistic theories with limited practical application. Sometimes theoretical issues are crucial, such as in Hume's is-ought distinction. Understanding such principles can prevent us from wasting our lives on illusions. Yet other studies, possibly in linguistic philosophy, can be highly misleading. So why have we done this study of prescriptivism as a methodological analysis of moral language? This question becomes more urgent in light of my podcast on Wittgenstein and language entitled Has Wittgenstein Done Philosophy More Harm Than Good? One answer is that we have increased our knowledge of language in the context of ethics, but more tellingly, we can now eliminate prescriptivism as directly relevant to the question of value as a principle of life. And this is how I proceed my continuing research to understand what I can do in life. So let me have your comments or criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.